Gonna go ahead and broadcast, and we'll see you guys in a few moments.
Good evening. My name is Brian Konkol. I serve as Dean of Hendricks Chapel and Professor of Practice at Syracuse University, and welcome to Matters That Matter. This is an online conversation series where we amplify intentional conversation about religion, spirituality, values, belief, and motivation. We invite our guests to share about choices made, difficulties encountered, and commitments solidified. This evening, our guest is the Reverend Dr. Luke Powery, who serves as Dean of Duke University Chapel and Associate Professor of Homiletics at Duke Divinity School. His teaching and research interests are located at the intersection of preaching, worship, pneumatology, and culture, particularly expressions of the African diaspora. He is the author of numerous books on preaching and African American spirituals. Prior to his appointment at Duke, he served as the Perry and Georgia Engel Assistant Professor of Homiletics at Princeton Theological Seminary. In 2014, he was inducted into the Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars at Morehouse College for his ethical and spiritual leadership in the academy, church, and broader society. Welcome, Dean Powery, virtually to Syracuse University. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Dean Konkol. It's great to be with you and to see you.
And I must say, in that opening slide, it's just a joy to see someone from Duke colored with orange on that part. So it's great to, you look good in orange. I want to say thanks for letting us do that.
You're stirring trouble up already. It's not even basketball season yet.
That's right. It's so good. It's so good to have you with us.
Thank you.
What a journey. You attended Stanford University. You studied music with a concentration on vocal performance, then off to Princeton Theological Seminary, eventually Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto. You've been a music director in Miami, director of summer youth program in California, associate pastor in Switzerland, and eventually Princeton and now Duke University. Could you share more about your story of call? What tugged, pushed, and pulled you into teaching and preaching?
Yeah, it's how much time do you have? That's the kind of big meta question. I grew up, just the short piece, I grew up in a preacher's home. So I'm number 5 of 5 kids. So I'm a PK, as they would say, a preacher's kid or party kid, depending on what you mean by that. And my father worked for the American Bible Society in New York City for many years, very ecumenical, preaching in Lutheran, Baptist, Presbyterian. So, and we were a very musical family. So faith was important, music was important, education was important. And, you've heard of the Jackson 5. We were the Powery 5. We would sing wherever my father would preach. So that's where I was nurtured, I would say, in the life of faith, but he never forced ministry, on any of us, actually. So, I was involved in church music, in the choirs at church. And eventually I went to Stanford and, here I am sitting in the preacher's seat in Duke Chapel. I'm doing the very thing I ran away from, if I'm to be honest. I went to Stanford to do computer engineering. My second oldest brother was already working for Hewlett Packard out there. So my vision was, let's be techie, as we would call it at Stanford. But I ended up being a fuzzy instead in humanities and music. But what happened was, okay, I have that foundation in the church. There were people from the community that were saying, Luke, you need to think about ministry. I thought they were crazy. I went to college and I took some classes freshman year, hated computer science, all right? Loved math. I was always loved math, so I kept on the math. Then, the question was, oh, okay, what are you going to be doing? What do you, this kind of utilitarian idea of what education is. And then it evolved. I took a music theory class, loved it. And so the wrestling, actually, the seeds were sown back in the day during high school, but here I was in college, now wrestling with this music, this being drawn to it as, studying it and wrestling with what am I doing here? There was an associate dean of the chapel at the time, Floyd Tompkins at Stanford, who became a mentor for me. I'm still in touch with him. And there became a time where I would meet with him weekly, to discern. And one week he said to me, Luke, if you can do anything else, he was talking about ministry, if you can do anything else other than ministry, go and do it. And I came back the following week and said, Floyd, I can't do anything else. And so it's been an evolution because I ended up, at the time, Stanford did not have a minor and a major. They only had double majors. And so at the time, it's like, well, I'm just going to go do music. But a part of that was about sacred music. A part of that was giving myself over to this call that I was wrestling with. Because even though I was in chorale and we were wearing tuxedos and trained in all the classical music, singing in French, Italian, German, etc., that wasn't my heart. I knew that music was the portal to ministry. Music was the portal to theological study. So I ended up going from Stanford to Princeton Theological Seminary to do a Master of Divinity. But I did not go with the intention of being ordained. I went with the intention of doing a master's in divinity and also a master's of sacred music at Westminster Choir College to do a dual degree. But what the journey has been this ever broadening sense of what ministry is. Because a year or two in the seminary, preaching came on the radar in a greater way. And then eventually ordination came on the radar, and then I ended up in Switzerland at a church as a pastor. But then that experience of practice on the ground, preaching more regularly, leading worship, led me to go back to graduate school because I had the burning yes. I had the burning yes that allowed me to say no to a good situation, which was living in Zurich, Switzerland. And so that pastorate then led to graduate study and then led to sort of teaching in the theological academy. But it has always been, someone told me, Luke, we need you in the church when I was thinking about going to grad school and thinking about theological education. But I never felt as if I was leaving the church by going to do theological education and teaching. For me, the teaching, the preaching, the writing, the speaking in different ways is all ministry for me. It's one thing. It manifests in different ways, but it's one thing. It's all ministry. It's all service, right? It's for the common good, whoever's in front of me. And so that's you have to be careful to never say never, right? Because that never can become forever. And so here I am 8 years later, at Duke Chapel. And so it's a journey, but it's a call. It's not a career, it's a calling. So, God called me here. And when the time comes, when my time's up, God will call me away, to something else, something new. And so I've been open. I've learned not to try to out-strategize God because you can't do it.
I love when you talk about the sense of calling, and that calling isn't just about, which direction we go, but it's also about how do we continue going in the way we're going in different ways. And when I think about your role there at Duke,
Yeah.
preacher, teacher, administrator, public commentator, there's a number of different calls within the call.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about, how do the different aspects of your work at Duke University, how do they feed each other?
Mm-hmm.
And also, how do they conflict with each other? What does that look like for you at Duke?
Sure. I think I do try to stay on, as I call it, one highway, right? Because I'm pulled in various directions at different times for different reasons. And my goal is to stay on the same highway, meaning what's my message? What's my emphasis? Am I still Luke? Because, if I take an exit here and an exit there, I'm getting off the path in some ways. I'm getting off the call. So for me, what I try to do is integrate all these things. When I'm preaching, perhaps I can connect to my teaching, and perhaps I can connect to my writing. And even if I blog something online, or how do these things integrate? So hopefully they're working together. Now, there can be times, so the public commentary, which is not necessarily done at Duke, and it's not done in the pulpit right here to my left. There are things perhaps that I feel more free to say in writing for public commentary than I would in the pulpit with people in front of me. Let's be honest. And so there is that, but at the same time, I see it all as a vocation of the word. Now, even as an administrator, a leader of a staff, I'm a steward of words, right? All of these things, we're being careful with words and caring with words. And so it's guiding people through words. So even administration. And of course, as an administrator, you have tough decisions. This is a time of COVID. This is a time of pandemics, plural. And so sometimes there are decisions that have to be made that are tough, that may not be viewed in a great way in public, talking about the public. But one knows as an administrator about confidentiality. One knows about internal courage. And, as a leader, as a preacher, look, just like Jesus, there were the cheers and the jeers. The same people that praised him later were full of rage and wanted to throw him off a cliff. So there is this sense that, sometimes there's the tension, but I try to keep them all integrated, because the truth is it keeps me sane, right? I'm one person. I'm still Luke. And it's what Parker Palmer talks about, how in this role, if we think of it, there's many roles, but how do you integrate your soul and your role so that it's you're one integrated person. You're not multiple people. You might be doing multiple things, but there's still a core to who you are and what you're about. It's a life of integrity. It's about the integrative life. And so striving for that's what I try to do along the way. I know I'm not successful all the time, but it is the motivation. It is the goal, the aim.
I want to remind our viewers, those who have tuned in directly here on the Zoom webinar platform, as well as those who are tuning in with us on Facebook Live, if you have a question for Dean Powery, please feel free to type it into the comments. Some members of the Hendricks Chapel staff will take a look at that and get those questions to me, and we'll ask those questions of Dean Powery. So again, if you got a question, comment, those joining us here in Syracuse, down in North Carolina, around the country, and around the world, feel free to type it on in and participate. We'd love to take your questions. Dean Powery, I love your books. You wrote back in 2017 the book Rise Up, Shepherd, Advent Reflections of the Spirituals. And then in 2019, you followed up with a Lenten reflection. And I love what you wrote specifically about your take on the African American spirituals. And I want to read back a little bit of your writing to you. You said that these spirituals are, and I quote, music memorabilia created on the anvil of misery by enslaved Blacks. They are sorrow songs. They are suffering songs. However, to sing can be a sting to the reality of suffering. It can be a sign of the hope and presence of God in the midst of agony. Could you share a little bit more about the spirituals and what they are saying and singing to us in this time?
Oh, man. All right, Dean Konkol.
I got all night, you know, I can hang out. I can hang out.
First, I think it's important to recognize is I call them the spirituals. I don't put an adjective on them. I know in our time we do, but because I try to name them as the enslaved did, and they just call them the spirituals, right? There wasn't the adjectives as we do in musicology, Negro spirituals or African American spirituals, or, you know, you name it. They're just the spirituals. Why? From an account of a former enslaved person, talks about how when the community was together in the spontaneous way that they were created, it was as if the Holy Spirit revealed them. And so you have the name spirituals. So for me, the spirituals are songs of the Spirit. If we think the Spirit, many times we often think the Spirit is, oh, just the highs of life and, you know, the mountaintops. But if we look within the biblical traditions, the Old and New Testament, we see, it's the Spirit that brings Ezekiel to the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel 37, or it's the Spirit that leads Jesus to the wilderness. Or if we take the Pauline theology from Romans, it's the Spirit who's groaning, not just us. So for me, the spirituals embody and reflect the groaning of the Spirit. And in the case of the spirituals, from a particular enslaved people historically. And for me, one of the things is it is the acknowledgement, it is the truth telling of inhumane suffering, of inhumane brutality. So if we think about what we're seeing throughout the nation, right, and the uprisings around the treatment of Black bodies, the spirituals cry out, just like one would say, no more auction block for me, no more mistress call for me, right? No more lash for me, many thousand gone. So there's a sense that the spirituals tell the truth about brutality against Black bodies, right? These are songs of the enslaved. They tell the truth about that and the suffering and the sorrow. But at the same time, there's something amazing. It's like Polly Murray in her poem, Polly Murray, hope is a song in a weary throat. That somehow even the melody, even the tune, because in the cultural myth of High John the Conqueror, that is a story that we hear throughout African American religious history. And history, Zora Neale Hurston tells it, others, High John takes the enslaved away, basically to heaven, and what they're given by Old Maker is a tune. They're not given any words. And so what happens in that story is these folks are given the gift of song and laughter. They talk about laughter as a form of resistance to the harsh realities. And so the spirituals are not only tell the truth, but they resist the enslavement, right? There's a double code, what's called double codes, a spiritual like steal away to Jesus. People think, oh, they're just singing, talking about going to heaven to Jesus. No, they're also saying, steal away. We're going to try to sneak out of here and go up north, right? Underground railroad. So it's a kind of subterranean spirituality that is at work. And so it's a form of resistance to the violence that we may see. So singing is, people talk about it in the civil rights. Song was the nonviolent weapon against oppression. Song, even as W.E.B. Du Bois talks about in his book, The Soul of Black Folks, was the soul of the people. So we're talking about something more than just singing an art song in a concert hall. We're talking about life and death. Singing is a matter of life and death. The spirituals are a matter of life and death, right? When we talk about the spirit working in the world, it's a matter of life and death. And what the spirituals do for our time is not only tell the truth, but of course they are communal, right? There's a sense, that's why we don't know who the composers are. We don't really know who wrote the lyrics or what their geographical location was. We have a sense that this is the community coming together, singing in the spirit, telling the truth, singing there is a balm in Gilead, right? Singing sooner we'll be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God. So there's an acknowledgement that I can't live by myself. I can't live on my own. If COVID hasn't taught us that, what will? We are interconnected. We need each other. It's like Hezekiah Walker, the gospel artist. I need you to survive. That's what the spirituals implicitly say. But even the melodies that rise, not just an explicit song like there is a balm in Gilead, right, the song of healing and hope, but just the intonation itself means, suggests, I'm still alive, right? And the machete, they said, the machete in the cotton field was dull without a song. So there's something powerful about the spirituals. It's not some slave ditty. It is the melodies of divine breath, embracing and coming through, in the case of the enslaved, coming through bodies that were not even deemed human beings. It's the reclamation of the humanity of Black people. That's what happens through the spirituals, through the spirit. The bodies that were lynched, hanging from trees. James Weldon Johnson talks about it in his preface to the 2 volumes of books of American Negro spirituals with his brother J. Roseman Johnson, who was the musician. He says there was a kind of swing to the performance of the spirituals. I see the performance and the embodiment of spirituals, at least historically, as a counter swing to the Black bodies that were swinging in lynching trees. And so what we have through this art, through this creative melody, through the enslaved, is the affirmation of humanity through a song, through a melody, through a tone. It's more than words. Sometimes all you have is a sound to express what's going on in our world today, a moan, a groan, a shriek. That's what the spirituals teach us. Sometimes you don't have the words to describe what happened to George Floyd. I can't breathe. You need to pick up a spiritual and hum it and let the spirit sing you and sing through you and breathe. Right? The breath of life into the world. So, I mean, Brian, I can go on and on about these songs and their relevance for our time and day, because they teach us that life is about life and death. And it is about survival, but it is also about resistance. It's also about hope. It's also about community and coming together. And ultimately, it's about life in the spirit, right? And breathing that life, singing that song into each other's lives and hearts.
You shared with our viewers where you're sitting and joining us is the preacher's seat at Duke Chapel. And I want to talk a little bit about preaching. And preaching in many ways is like a vehicle. People might see it and think that's a nice looking car, but you look under the hood and teach preaching. And thinking about your own preaching, I read a quote of yours where you talked about, and this is a direct quote, beginning with the excavation of your own soul and to see yourself in the presence of God, to take a good look at yourself before you look at the congregation. I'm wondering, Dean Powery, in your own preaching and teaching, what has sermon preparation and proclamation revealed, or shall we say excavated, about your own soul these days?
I actually wrote those words.
Yeah.
Um,
Direct quote.
direct quote. You know, I think preaching is such a humbling task. It's about humility. It's about risk. It's about what Bonhoeffer says when Jesus calls you to come and die. And I think something happens that a part of us dies every time we preach. And for me, I have come to see the excavation is, woe is me. It's like Isaiah, woe is me. Who am I to even be getting up in the pulpit to say anything? And so it's really been the acknowledgement and the recognition of my humanity. My humanness. And that's where humility, I mean, we're humans, humus, meaning from the earth. You know, my students at Princeton used to call me Dr. Death. So, I mean, I'm thinking about life and death again, right? What are we? Dust. We don't just need Ash Wednesday to say, you know, you're dust and to dust you will return and get the ash. No, that's our life. We are dusty creatures from the dust of the earth. And yet God, as we would say, uses us to proclaim God's word, in fleshed word even. And so for me, it has been a very humbling journey. You know, I think people, when they come into an elevated pulpit here, and, you know, they know all of the people in the history. There's been some wonderful people throughout the history of preaching here at Duke Chapel who have come through, Desmond Tutu and the Billy Grahams of the world, and Benjamin Mays and Rosemary Ruther. But what people often don't understand is what Gardner Taylor would call preaching sweet torture. Or James Earl Massey, the burdensome joy, right? So for me, I can only speak for myself, the call to preach, and again, doing the very thing I ran away from in a university context, can be torturous, right? It's like the call narratives are like Moses, I can't speak. Jeremiah, I'm too young. Mary, how can this be since I'm a virgin? And so this kind of honest, open questioning, you know, who, me? God? You know, and so it causes me to trust God, if I'm to be honest. You know, with all the gifts and study and the mystery of preaching. It's like what Howard Thurman basically says, that your practice doesn't necessarily guarantee the presence. So you can pray rightly, or what you think is right, or preach correctly even as you've been taught, but it doesn't guarantee the presence. And that, if that does anything, it should keep you humble. That all we can do is we make an offering. I call it an offering on the altar that is the pulpit. Each week, or however often we preach, and then we move on. But understanding that the future of the word is in God's hands, and that somehow someone gets something out of anything you say. That's a miracle. An image, a story, an idea, something in their imagination. They see the synergies between fields and art and science and this university science context, and chemistry and theology. What are you talking about? It's the Spirit again at work. It's the mystery that you understand, like this neo-Gothic cathedral, that I'm so small, right? And God is so big. And that's why we pray that little prayer, oh Lord, be good to me. The sea is so wide and my boat is so small. And so that's how I feel when I preach, and the illumination, or the excavation of my souls. I'm so small, I'm so little in all of this.
For our viewers, one little secret I'll share for those who are tuning in around the country and the world is that Dean Powery accepted my invitation to come to Syracuse back in November of 2017. When I was installed as Dean of Hendricks Chapel, I was asked to invite a speaker, and I invited Dean Powery to come, and I'm still grateful. Almost, a couple of years later here, that you did that. It was wonderful. And I still remember your words when you spoke that night. And one of the things that I think about is you spoke about Socrates, and that when you want wisdom as much as you want air, then you will begin to find wisdom. And we think about education, about being more than just career preparation, or even more than just the acquisition of information, but this sense of personal formation and even public transformation. I would love to hear you share a little bit more about how is it that you, whether it's from the pulpit, the classroom, or walking down the sidewalk, help students to pursue more than just a ticket to an entry-level job, but help them to find a trajectory towards an extraordinary life. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and I'm grateful to you for that invitation during your installation days. What's so interesting, there's a turn that has happened here at Duke, and it probably predates me, right? It's a graduate. Universities take a long time to turn. But a greater emphasis on purpose and meaning across the whole university. There has been a recognition that education is more, I think in theological education, we use that language of formation, and there's something more. But in talking about any field, right, in the broader university, there is this sense that how do we help students become more fully human? That's how I think of it. And for me, whether it's seeking wisdom, it's remember you are a human being. That becomes so critical to me. In talking to students just a couple of weeks ago, juniors and seniors, I was on a Zoom with just a few of them. And they were, juniors and seniors are not on campus this semester at Duke, only first and second year students, but they're local, like in apartments. And they talked about, you could see it on their face going through this pandemic, isolation, loneliness, all of the things that, many are going through. And whether it's that during a pandemic or it's the idea that remember you're a human being and to be whole, one, how are you, what my question is, how are you remembering your humanity? So yes, reading, studying is a part of that, but what about play? Right? What about delighting in creation? Are you walking in nature? What other things are you doing to participate in the beauty of creation? Photography? Are you into sports, right? Again, that's a way of connecting with people in God's creation. So knowing that you are more than a head on a stack of books, right? Or in a lab, a chemistry lab, that your life is more than a lab or more than a book. It's more than our jobs, right? So what I asked those things for myself when I was on sabbatical and now back during this time. Who is my life? What is my life? Because I think students and really any of us can get to a place where the life that wants to live in and through us is not the life that we are living. And so to help students pull back from the hustle and bustle and all of the Snapchat and the texting and the instrumentation of our living, to breathe. That's why there's a big press for mindfulness. Right? Slow down, breathe. Remember where you are, remember who you are, remember whose you are, remember where you come from, remember your loves, remember your hates. I mean, the challenge is we have what Thurman would call the jangling echoes of our turbulence, so often stirring in our human lives that it's difficult to help students and ourselves to slow down and watch yourself pass by. And so to help, where do you find the wisdom? You got to slow down, and participate in life. Do things that you may not always do, your joys. And I think that's so much more than a traditional classroom, so much more than a career. What is your life? Has become a key question for me.
It seems like what you're connecting there is not just this conversation on purpose and meaning, but also that other broader conversation that we're hearing a lot more now in colleges and universities around health and well-being. And it's almost as if I hear you saying, when we're connecting who I am with what I do, that is part of that journey. Could you share a little bit more about your work at the chapel, your work in the classroom, and how it is that you see colleges and universities in this time helping to nourish health, well-being, or shall we say, not just the struggle to get A's and B's, but the struggle to be well. What
Yeah.
is that like for you?
Yeah. Oh man. Let me tell you, I mean, it's a challenge. Let's just be honest. Right. Let's tell the truth like the spirituals. It's a challenge. Um, Much of the current work being done at Duke is virtual, even with students. Now, students, first and second year, are on campus, and others who are in town can come to campus if there are in-person classes. But the majority of classes are virtual. Not all, like mine's a hybrid. So, but many of the activities, the cultural centers, through student affairs, as an example, have chosen to do a lot of virtual. There are students on campus, so there are people on campus with them. There are, they can take advantage of the outdoors. I mean, this has been because there's, there's restrictions on being inside and numbers and that kind of thing. And so last week in schools, it's been a couple of weeks in, but now there's a pattern, a rhythm where some students are, taking yoga to the quad, as an example. So it's like the push to be outside with others, even if you're socially distanced and wearing a mask, because you can have the human connection, because that's a big piece, right? Even on Zoom, and you're still by yourself, really, physically. Even though it's good, it's not the same as the enfleshed bodies, right? Breath and bones. And so part of it for us, what we've been doing as we turn the corner, because we have been, I would say, strapped and trying to make decisions around operational financial impact of COVID. As we are moving out of that now, for students, there's one-on-one meetings, right? Check-ins, calling people. Don't wait on them to reach out. You reach out to them. That's been taking the initiative to reach out to students virtually. One-on-one check-ins has become key. And there's going to be, conversations around faith and learning. We call framing your faith. That's going to be for students. Eventually, the choirs, we have 3 choirs, and this big choir obviously is not singing and not even, meeting, but they're doing a virtual rehearsal. Funny enough, I think I don't know the latest number, but like 15 new people signing up, and they're not even in person. So connecting, reaching out to students in various ways to try to form community virtually has been a move. And then we have a community engagement. We do, there are limits, obviously, depending on your city and the restrictions, but there's a community pathways fellows that live in a house intentional Christian community in a home we rent in the west end of Durham, and they connect to nonprofits. They are living together, and obviously have formed their own bubble, so to speak, and pod, but they are connecting to various nonprofits. And so that's a part of the holistic approach to education still, even as you have to adapt and try to determine, what is what, because there's a lot of fear too. Let's be honest. It's not just there's fear about being together or being in certain spaces, or, should I come on campus and be in this group with this amount of people, and anxiety. And so trying to help people, I think, again, mindful practices, through our health system here has become important, and through the wellness center that we have through student affairs. Definitely has been, and the encouragement to physical exercise. So I think all of these things work together for a whole person to be well in our time. And so, those are some of the things, nothing earth shaking, but it's trying to be intentional, though. It's the intentionality around connection, around physical exercise, mindfulness, scripture reading, the spiritual practices as a whole, and trying to connect in community, have some kind of formation of community. It's a challenge, but yet you continue to walk that path.
Talk about intentionality, and one of the things I love about these opportunities to have a conversation with you is to have intentional conversation about, per the title of the program, Matters That Matter. And when we've been thinking about these last few months, we've been thinking about crises, multiple, and that one of the consequences of crisis is clarity around matters that most matter. And as I think about us finishing this conversation here with this last question, I'm curious, Dean Powery, about our students here at Syracuse, your students there at Duke. What is the clarity that you're hoping they can receive in the midst of this time? What's the clarity that you hope they can intentionally engage with, so that they'll be able to think about matters that matter and act on matters that matter?
Yeah. For me, it comes back, this is my theme, it's come on clarity going forward. It is fundamental. It is that we are all created in the image of God. It is the imago Dei. It is the embrace of our common humanity. And that has to do with COVID, right? It comes back to what I was saying earlier. That has to do with the racial tensions and protests, right? What I was saying earlier about dust. We are humans from the earth, and we're from the dust. And what would happen if we would live and operate in the world through what I call the ethics of dust? If we would see each other for who we really are, dust, right? And that's the common ground. As humans, our feet are on the ground, the dust of the earth, and all created in the image of God. And so when we see the tensions, when we see the health disparities around COVID, how it's impacting various groups, we see the racial protests, we see the violence on the streets in Portland, Oregon, or Kenosha, Wisconsin, right? Violence against another human being is anti-human, right? Which to me is anti-God. Because I, in the Christian tradition, a God who became a human being when God wanted to demonstrate love for us. And so to me, the clarity around our humanness and I think of the civil rights movement, they would hold up signs and say, I am a man. What we see happening, even in our discussions at universities around diversity, inclusion, equity, and these kinds of things, fundamentally, it is people wanting to be recognized as people, as human beings, to say, I am a human being. And so how do we live? How do we work in ways that affirms the humanity of one another? Because the truth is, we are in an interconnected web of mutuality. And until we recognize each other's humanity and recognize ourselves, each other as dust, we will continue to, I think, struggle along in our society as we have been, because there's an ethic to the recognition that we are dust, how we talk to each other, how we talk about each other, how we treat one another, but it's also systemic and structural, right? How do we treat our fellow human beings? What kind of systems and structures are in place that will foster the flourishing of all people, all human beings? So for me, it is the clarion call to our common humanity. And it comes back to dust and breath for me, Dean Konkol. Because to dust we've come, from dust we have come, and to dust we will return.
Dean Powery, thank you for being with us. We wish you and the Duke University community the fullness of health and hope in the midst of these incredibly important times. We thank you for blessing us here at Syracuse with your presence virtually this evening. And to all that joined us here for Matters That Matter, wherever you are, we do thank you. We look forward to joining you again next week for another conversation. But for now, we wish you, again, the fullness of all life. Have a great night, and God bless you.
Thanks so much.